Well, good afternoon, everyone. Um, Welcome to our conference, Spirituality in a Diverse Key. My name is Naveen Sultan, and I'm an assistant professor in the Clinical Mental Health Counseling Program at the University of St. Thomas. And welcome to our program. I'm sure some of us have met face-to-face in past programs, and it's good to see some of you. It's good to see all of you. So I'm just going to offer a little bit of helpful information to start us off, and then introduce a couple of folks. So I just would like everyone to know that we're recording this meeting. So if you don't want to appear, you can go ahead and turn your camera off. And if you also don't want your name to show, please feel free to change your name. If you want to know how to do that, there's on the top right of your screen, there are three little buttons. There's a button with three little buttons that you can click on, and you can rename yourself. So you can call yourself however you would like to be called today. Sky's the limit. We're going to have a Q&A after each presentation. So each presentation will be about 60 minutes, and we have two speakers today, and after each presentation we'll have a Q&A of about 10 to 15 minutes. So if you would like to, you can start typing questions into the chat area, and then we will start regulating the Q&A. And the person who will be doing that is Dr. Jennifer Boswell, so I'm going to ask her to go ahead and introduce herself right now.
Thank you, Naveen. Good afternoon, everyone. So my name is Jennifer Boswell. I am the current chair of the Counseling and Human Services Department at the University of St. Thomas, and also a faculty member in our clinical mental health counseling program. I'm really just delighted to be a part of this program this afternoon, and just a warm thank you to both Naveen and Sean for inviting our program and myself into this wonderful discussion. So I look forward to not only hearing from the presenters, but also hearing all the different questions that you have of the presenters in the chat box. And I will be sharing those with the presenters as we move forward in the program this afternoon. So thank you, Naveen.
Thank you, Jennifer. So now I would like to invite Sean Fitzpatrick, who has been a really, really good friend and partner working with these conferences for the past few years, but I know that he has been doing this for many more years. So Sean?
Thank you, Naveen, and it's been just wonderful to work with you and the University of St. Thomas over the Naveen, you've been with the program now four years, is that right?
This is my 6th year.
This is your 6th year. This is your 6th year. Time flies. Well, I welcome everyone, and I'll say there's a bit of synchronicity, a strong piece of synchronicity for me and for this conference today, in that my morning today started with coffee, which I try to have about once a month, with Elizabeth Maynard, who was the chair of the Clinical Mental Health Counseling Program, and she is now, those of us who know her, she is now a Foreign Service official in Shanghai, and she sends her warm greetings. I was having coffee, and she was getting ready to go to bed. It was at 9 o'clock in Shanghai. So welcome everybody. Thank you for being here. And I said to Naveen and Jennifer as we got started that I do actually, for those of us who have participated in these conferences before, we normally would meet at Scanlon Hall on the St. Thomas campus, and I miss that. I miss the opportunity to be in the same room with everyone, and I'm still experiencing, and I think a real sense of loss about that. And also I'm really grateful that we have this way of continuing to connect in the middle of the pandemic, and to have a conversation, a meaningful conversation about religion and mental health and the search for meaning. This set of conferences began in 2008, I believe. So this is 12 years and counting that we've been having these conversations. We're fortunate to have had these conferences underwritten. And for some years we had a donor who wished to be acknowledged. And right now we have a donor who does not wish to be acknowledged. And we are grateful for their support of this conversation. It is really my honor to introduce Andrea Messineo to all of you, our first speaker. I'll tell you about her biography, and then I want to share just a little bit about my experience of her. So Andrea is in her second career as a psychotherapist. Her first career was in the financial world, and she actually she's an alum of the University of St. Thomas. She received her PhD in philosophy in 2008 and taught in the philosophy department at the university. She but then she decided to become a psychotherapist. She trained at Our Lady of the Lake University, received her degree in 2010 from OLLU. She lived in Rome, Italy for several years. She has experience working in inpatient and outpatient hospital settings in addition to her private practice. And I'll say personally that she's written just an extraordinary work of poetry called Alone in Church. It is, I will very happily plug it. It is for sale through the Young Center, but also you can find it on Amazon and in other places. I had the great pleasure of reading it, and we were talking just before we started about the impact that it's had on me in the classroom. One of the poems from her work I've shared as a part of an ethics workshop, and I find her work to be beautiful and thoughtful and extraordinarily clear and perceptive about things we don't usually talk about, and that we're right at the intersection of spirituality and what we have come to understand or come to talk about as neurodiversity, and the differences and the real human suffering that comes from not feeling that one fits into the space that the majority makes available without thinking about how it affects those who are not in the majority. So I couldn't be more honored to welcome Andrea here, and I'm so looking forward to what she has to share with us today. Andrea.
Thank you so much, Sean, for your kind and gracious words. I can say that the Jung Center has been a constant presence throughout my time in Houston. What has it been? 25 years. It's hard to believe, but always, in my spiritual growth and seeking, I always seem to return somehow to the resources that the Jung Center offers, as well as these talks year after year in conjunction with St. Thomas University, and that these slender threads would somehow combine to find me here speaking and participating, giving back today, is just such an honor and a privilege. I'm so grateful to be here. Thank you. So today I want to share with you some of my thoughts on the experience of believers on the autism spectrum within a tradition of Western Christianity. And you'll bear with me as I try to share I have a few PowerPoint slides prepared. And that idea, the experience of believers on the spectrum, can immediately raise a question. Because when we think of Christianity, of church, we think of an essentially communal enterprise, the many made into one body by faith and love. On the other hand, autism, which comes from the same root word as autonomy, denotes someone who is at ease when to oneself and is fundamentally challenged by social situations. So, what can the church have to offer those on the autism spectrum, or vice versa? Some, like noted autism spokesperson Temple Grandin might argue, not much. In her conversations with neurologist Oliver Sacks, recorded in An Anthropologist on Mars, she indicated that she had given up orthodox belief in favor of a, quote, scientific God, and that she herself found higher meaning through her work in humane cattle slaughter. On the other hand, Catholic spiritual director and self-identified person with autism, Christopher Goodchild, feels that, quote, throughout history, there have been many men and women in the spectrum called to live the contemplative life. That was a quote that was a post to the Wrong Planet blog. But what forms might that life take? How could we recognize it? Well, if you were to meet a nun who screamed at her sisters when they disturbed her in prayer, would you consider her a likely candidate for sainthood? Or a brother who was asked to leave an elite group of monks because his unusual practices were too much even for them? How about someone who slept outside in the snow? We will meet men and women who did these things and more, creating aloneness around them. In a sense, this was their charism. They reversed the walls. Their outside was how they came in to Christ and to others, for all the while they were growing in charity and the other virtues. But maybe first a few words of introduction about myself, since, as I said, I'm new to these talks. And given that we are in a Jungian context, it may not be inappropriate to begin with a dream. So I had a dream when I began first to develop notes for this presentation. It went like this. I am looking at Airstream type trailers. They are old and shabby, with paint peeling off the outsides. Inside, it is rounded, and everything can be reached from around a central table in the shape of an intersected circle, like this. So it has been my personal and professional experience that dreams contain guidance, though of course they have many layers of meaning or possible interpretation. So for example, the idea of old and shabby. Possibly you've seen me at the local supermarket or taqueria, or walking around St. Thomas campus for exercise dressed in some old outfit. And you're now wondering, why is this lady up here on the screen talking to you? What is my authority or experience? So I want to reach for our topic from 4 directions, using 4 languages or perspectives that I have access to and will switch between. So first, the language of the autism spectrum experience. And I hope to speak not just in clinical terms, but to try to portray that experientially, because so much of the literature is othering, speaking of it from the outside. I hope to convey some of the experience of spectrum believers from the inside. The second language is philosophical, that which reflects on experience, gives it a second layer of meaning. Why, how, where is it going? And as Sean mentioned, I earned my PhD at St. Thomas over a decade ago, and it's a great pleasure and honor to be invited back. The third language is the psychospiritual. Again, as was mentioned, I've had a second degree and career as a psychotherapist with a focus on adult Asperger's and a research interest in particular on how church practices may be supportive or not to persons on the autism spectrum. And as I said, we will look at some venerable men and women from church history with autism type traits and their practices. And fourthly, I have the term anonymous. And that name comes from the old practice of religious persons not signing their written work. You may have seen in Doherty Library some books from pre-Vatican II that are signed, or the author is by a Benedictine monk or a Carmelite nun. And the purpose of that is to signify humility and the submerging of the ego in the collective. Right? And in recent years, I find as I try to write, express my ideas, they come forth in some surprising imaginal genres that don't feel as if they're coming from the everyday ego. And I will share some of those with you. So first, some clinical language. The Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of mental disorders. That's what is given to us to discuss psychological issues. How autism spectrum is defined there. First criteria is persistent deficits in social communication and social interaction. For example, not knowing how to join a conversation, how to take turns, how to avoid monologuing, maintain eye contact, make small talk, etc. Second criterion, restricted or repetitive patterns of behavior, interests, or activities, such as collecting things that are typically of little interest, such as matchbooks or train schedules. Insistence on doing things always in the same way, going by the same route, etc. This criterion can also include hyper or hyposensitivity, such as a dislike for all but a few food tastes and textures, sensitivity to the flickering of fluorescent light. Yet on the other hand, someone might not seem to mind a loud vacuum or might dress the same way in all seasons, and so forth. Might include less sensitivity also to the internal bodily sensations by which we orient ourselves in space. That's poor proprioception, and that leads to difficulties, say playing sports, driving a car, so forth. For the DSM, the symptoms had to be present in the early developmental period. As with all disorders in that book, they need to cause significant impairment in important areas of functioning. They can't just be a little quirk or so forth. And they cannot be better explained by intellectual disability or developmental delay, because those are addressed in other categories. Per the CDC's 2018 report by their Autism and Developmental Disabilities Monitoring Network, 1 in 59 children were identified with an autism spectrum disorder. It's 1.7% overall, with boys 4 times more likely than girls to receive an autism diagnosis. So, it is likely that every leader of a religious congregation has several neuroatypical worshipers in attendance. And I'll note that in this presentation, I will be focusing on adults, although at the end I will give resources for inclusive ministry for the differently able of all ages, including children. And it's always a challenge to know how much self-disclosure, if any, will be helpful, or when it may be a distraction. While it would be going far afield to discuss if or how DSM-5 traits have played a role in my self-understanding overall, I can comment in the area of spirituality. I belong to a faith community, and I have certainly identified with the spectrum experience in that context over the years. I have felt a preference for solitude or one-to-one interactions in spiritual practice, and have felt challenged sharing in large group worship as typical of parishes. I have felt that the intensity of light, sound, and touch was too great in such situations. I have felt that many of my interests and concerns were not shared by the larger group of faithful, as well as the presumption, so often reported by persons on the spectrum, that I would submit or sacrifice my inclinations to those of the majority. So just that bit of personal background to contextualize my research and clinical practice, which is, as I mentioned, serves, among others, adults on the autism spectrum. And it has been my privilege to know other extreme introverts who shared some of these concerns, such as Pittman McGehee, one of my mentors, who said, "I don't even like going to church or being around a lot of people. I like everything about being a priest but that." And that's remarkable if you know that at the height of his ecclesial career, Pittman was Dean of Christ Church Cathedral in downtown Houston, had been considered for Episcopal Bishop of Texas, and was known for mystical sermons before thousands of listeners. We can adapt, we can mask and act counter to our deep inclinations. Women on the spectrum especially are skilled at social mimicry. I've written about that. But at a certain point, Pittman sought out a situation where he could devote himself to inner work. He became a Jungian analyst. What if the church situation could shift in accordance with spectrum strengths? These are not from the DSM-5, these are mine. My summary of strengths exhibited by persons on the spectrum. They are able to work, to be in solitude. They are able to focus on the task of interest for long periods of time. They are able to speak out against organizational wrongs, to be a whistleblower, or as we would say in a religious context, have a prophetic charism. They are able to excel in environments where their needs are met. And they are able to participate in describing their own experience. And I think this last one is important because when we move to a strength-based perspective, it is no longer just a question of accommodating the neurodiverse faithful, so the larger group modify our practice so that the smaller group can participate. And I think it's more a question of collaboration, right? Recognizing that the neurodiverse group already has a practice, and how can we all come together to be enriched? Anyway, these strengths seem like real assets to a church, as they would be to any organization. Moving on to the language of philosophy. In the structure of scientific revolutions, Thomas Kuhn argued that the history of science is not linear, but at least during times of great change, radically different worldviews supersede one another. That is, one school of thought is not defeated by argumentation, but it simply falls away as a new generation of thinkers shifts focus. And this is based on the consensus of the research community on what problems are important to be solved. So applying this idea to our current topic, almost within living memory, understandings of autism, its cause, its prevalence, its prognosis, etc., have shifted. For example, in the 60s and 70s, researchers who thought autistic children with self-harming behaviors were best treated by electric shocks and slaps to the face, they did not argue against the psychodynamic school who felt that autism was caused by mothers not loving their children enough. And believe me, I wish I was kidding, but these were two competing ideas at the time. The behaviorists simply were not interested in discussing causes. So we have now moved beyond both of those worldviews to an understanding of genetics and the place of the autism spectrum in human neurodiversity. What is pathologized in one context may be honored in another. For example, what I did a few moments ago by considering autism spectrum strengths. So I was the researcher then. I was establishing consensus on what was important to focus on. And I think it's important for the neurodiverse faithful to be aware that there are role models in the history of Western spirituality who display similar traits. because often the model held up for emulation is the outgoing, proselytizing, and highly emotive believer. And this can lead to feelings of discouragement, feeling less than. I can certainly recall in my own younger days feeling that something was amiss when I did not have the inclination to, for example, confront strangers and bear witness to them about the faith. So, a few historical examples. Going back almost to the beginning of the Christian story. The desert fathers and mothers began to move to the Egyptian and Syrian deserts in the 3rd century, especially after Constantine's Edict of Milan ended the persecution of Christians, in order to seek slow martyrdom through penitential practices, since actual martyrdom was no longer available. Simeon Stylites entered the religious life by age 16. And prior to that, he had lived the solitary life of a shepherd. Aloof from what little companionship there was in the hermitage, he so irked the sensibilities of his fellow anchorites by his constant penances that he was asked to leave their enclave. He stayed shut up in a hut for 1.5 years and abstained from food and drink for all 40 days of Lent, a feat deemed miraculous at the time. Simeon took to standing upright while praying until he collapsed, then to doing the same on top of a pillar, first 9 feet tall, then gradually up to 50 feet high. He prayed while exposed to all sorts of elements, there's that sensory hyposensitivity, with only a small railing to protect him from falling off his platform. Visitors were permitted, one at a time, up a ladder, or he might address them by preaching at a distance or by letter. A wall was eventually erected around his pillar to keep curious crowds from disturbing his prayerful concentration. Now, of course, we don't have enough access to information about Simeon's personality or about any of the historical personages I will discuss to make an actual retrospective diagnosis of autism. But what I find interesting and evocative is the symbolism. Being ejected from an already reclusive community, further isolating oneself from humanity by means of a physical structure, so on. And he inspired a movement of similar ascetics. They're described as the pillar saints. Stelos means pillar or column. And in the icon to the right, he's pictured with Simeon Stylites the Younger. And I just find hilarious the fact that sometimes 2 of these type of ascetics would take up residence on pillars within hearing distance of each other so that they could engage in shouted arguments about points of doctrine when they were not engaged in prayer. The next historical example, moving on to medieval Italy, is Agnes of Montepulciano. And she showed what we might today call spectrum traits from a young age, such as preferring to play by herself rather with her peers. And in this play, she indulged her special interest by repetitively performing religious rituals, such as building play altars. And in that milieu, these inclinations were interpreted as marks of predestination, such that her parents were persuaded to allow her to enter a monastery at the age of 9, where she showed such an affinity for the religious life that she was elected the superior of a new monastery at the extraordinarily young age of 15. But here she encountered an autism typical setback. For the sisters who later testified in her canonization proceedings recalled that, whereas before being promoted to superior, she had spoken to them very eloquently about heavenly things, and persons on the spectrum can typically monologue quite knowledgeably about their special interest. Afterwards, though, she seems to have struggled with the interpersonal demands of management and the conflict these brought to her desire to maintain an independent routine of prayer. The sisters testified that she retreated to her cell, barely speaking at all. And when they tried to approach her, even about pressing matters, she would yell at them and accuse them of wishing to disturb her union with Christ. Nonetheless, Agnes excelled in the practice of contemplative prayer, enjoying many spiritual visions, and was known as a wonder worker. In the more mature years of her life, she was sought after for her gifts as a peacemaker and mediator between warring factions. Next, I want to look at what have been described as the holy fools. And these have been cited by autism researcher Uta Frith as examples of autism in an ecclesial context. This recognized way of living the gospel, especially in the Eastern Orthodox tradition, placed one deliberately outside the bounds of community by practices such as living outdoors, wearing scant clothing in the harsh wintertime, and engaging in purposeless activities such as carrying chains or rocks. Like medieval court jesters, holy fools could speak truth to power and were heeded as having a prophetic function embedded in their nonsense. So pictured on the left is Xenia of St. Petersburg, wearing her deceased husband's military coat. After his death, she took to sleeping outside, as well as asking to be called by another male name. And in the icon, she is surreptitiously bringing bricks at night to the construction site of a church. And on the right, returning once again to medieval Italy. Early Franciscan spirituality is just, for me, filled with moments of aloneness, that is, being placed outside the institutional church. The moment when Francis gave his clothes back to his father in the public square before the bishop, when he felt called to rebuild the church, when his associate Claire was called, she ran away from home. Francis cut off her hair in a little chapel in the woods, then placed her in a Benedictine monastery of nuns, but she wasn't to join them. She was to wait until he was able to place her in her own convent, again outside the walls of Assisi. Many such episodes. But like Simeon, Brother Juniper here, one of the first followers of Francis, was too much at times, even for the early Franciscans' novel expressions of spirituality. In this picture is the scene where Juniper is letting a beggar remove his habit, just take it off of him, because he had been instructed not to give away his clothes any longer. So this and other incidents in Juniper's life can caution us against a too literal black and white interpretation of religious commands that can sometimes be a pitfall for persons on the spectrum. But nonetheless, St. Francis himself praised the childlike simplicity of Brother Juniper. And bringing us up to modern times, Simone Weil was an intellectually brilliant political philosopher of the early 20th century who showed many autism spectrum traits. In general, she was physically clumsy, maldexterous, with poor proprioception. Her friends said that whenever she would cross the street, she would avoid being hit by a car through sheer luck. From the age of weaning, she was hypersensitive to the textures of certain foods. This caused her eating problems throughout her life. She was raised in Paris, the heart of fashion, yet she was noted for her idiosyncratic clothing. She would wear a full-length cape with sandals on her bare feet and sometimes a little beret. She could be tactless. She, as a student, would knowingly argue against an instructor's position. As a worker, she congratulated a factory owner on the occasion of a general strike. She was also uncompromising. She would abruptly cut friends out of her life if they failed to live up to her high ideals. She was raised by secular Jewish parents, and she felt disconnected from the historical Jewish people. In fact, Simone exemplifies the theme of aloneness very particularly, as she never seemed able to find rest for very long in any of the professions or ideologies she briefly espoused. Marxist, teacher, union organizer, free French resistance during World War II. She rejected them all in turn, disillusioned. Toward the end of her life, she began to have mystical experiences of Christ in prayer, ever increasing in depth and intensity. She spent long hours in adoration before the Eucharist and identified greatly with Christ's passion. Yet she continued to relate to church as from the outside. One, because of her argumentative bent, she would pepper priests with questions and doubts about dogmas. She once addressed to a sympathetic Dominican a 32-page letter in tiny script, worrying about 35 heretical propositions that she might have to give up believing in case she converted. But secondly, because of her great identification with a divided France and the alienated society of that time in general, she considered that God may wish to have, quote, some men and women who have given themselves to him and to Christ, and yet who remain outside the church. It's remarkable, a spirituality of outsideness. So let us pass on to examine some of the practices in the Western contemplative tradition that were favored by the holy persons we have just seeing. And at this point, I begin to interweave the psychospiritual with the anonymous due to considerations of time. So I want to read, if you will, a selection, a verse that's called Silence. He dreamed he beat upon a glass wall, but no one heard on the other side. Then, as all spoke easily in a round, he broke through at an inopportune time. They grasped for his hands and face and asked for his credentials. Under harsh glare and echoing din, in pressing crowds, inescapable. Then, waking, he sees to his right and to his left, clothed in snowdrift attire, brothers standing in solemn joy, bearing witness to their love in silence. By the welcome of that soundless word, detours and exclusions are repaired. Alpha and omega points come together. The harm of Babel is undone. And I sometimes reflect on St. Paul with his descriptions of all the activities taking place at the Lord's Supper of his day: preaching, teaching, prophecy, tongues, interpretation, discernment of spirits, psalms, hymns, spiritual songs. And since, as we are told, the Eucharist is meant to foreshadow the heavenly banquet, I am reminded of the complaint of my mentor, Pittman McGehee, who also said, is there going to be any room for introverts in paradise with all that singing and socializing? But then I reflect on the tradition that has come down to us in the West through monasteries, which in their daily routine are also intended to foreshadow the life of heaven. And in the monastery, there is the expectation during the working day that speech will be kept to the necessary minimum. And then at night, there is the great silence between evening prayer and morning prayer of the next day, when no speech at all is permitted. And this practice embodies many values in relation to our topic. It may challenge the neurotypical to do without the familiar tools by which status and in-out demarcations are established, and to show forth charity by means of nonverbals. And it also allows neuroatypicals to be valued for something other than what may be their stumbling block. That is how they express themselves in speech. But of course, silence in monasteries is not an absolute value. It is interspersed by the lifting up of the voice in song. And on that note, I would like to share with you another bit of verse, if I may. This one is an excerpt from a piece called Migraine. In the time before, when the aura gives its warning, there is a busyness together with rituals of warding. We take rescue medications and ask, will they work? Did I wait too long? We do all the other things that may have stopped the night flower from blooming in the past. Store up provisions, make arrangements while we still can, for the hours when we will be immobile like Christ on the cross. When the migraine is upon me, I would wish to pray, but can only briefly glimpse a prior intention. As the lament, my God, why have you forsaken me? Intones a cherished psalm, then fades away. There is a need to find an equilibrium or poise instead of the nothingness. To take up a stance outside of oneself from which the pain can be observed, rather than frantically seeking to escape it. The path of flight leads nowhere profitable. If I am able, I sometimes seek consolation in places of worship, only to be met with glaring lights, reverberating mics, people joyfully shouting. Is there nowhere to be found what used to be called a low mass, with quiet recitation of the service by candlelight? And there's interesting book by Thomas Day. It's called Why Catholics Can't Sing. From back 1992. Thomas Day is a music director of the church. It contains many pertinent observations, among which he points out that churches used to be built with acoustics in mind, as sound boxes to carry the voice of the preacher forward to all the parts. But after the advent of the microphone, this was no longer a consideration. But he noted, as did the other music directors, that around this time, the congregational singing started to drop off, which was odd. And he wondered, why should this be? Now that we have this a great sound system. But he points out, unless you are professionally trained, to sing on stage, it's very difficult to compete with someone whose voice is being electronically amplified up there with the microphone, cantor, someone. It's virtually impossible to hear the sound that is coming out of your own voice box, and it's equally challenging to coordinate with your own neighbors. It's easier just to let the soloist, the cantor, carry on alone. And I've observed myself in the brief periods when the electricity is knocked out by the tropical storms here in Houston, and there are no microphones. The congregation rises to the occasion and it recovers its voice just fine. So chant is like that. Volume is achieved by the layering of voices. No one person is outstanding, and emotion is conveyed through understatement and restraint of range, not through operatic highs and lows. Saint Augustine said, "He who sings prays twice." And in this type of meditative song, there is opportunity for the mind to linger upon the subject of the words and to pass into states of deeper consciousness and union with mystery. Taizé is an example. It's simple and repetitive by design. And I'll just note Simone Weil, that we looked at a few moments ago. She suffered greatly with migraine, but she noted that when she was able to visit a Benedictine monastery and was exposed to for the first time to Gregorian chant, she had almost an out-of-body experience where she was able to leave her suffering behind and be absorbed in the beauty of that song. So autismspeaks.org, in its section on sensory issues, offers some examples of accommodations that may be done to facilitate worship services for the neurologically diverse. Could introduce dimmed lights, incandescent versus fluorescent lighting, or sunglasses or visor to block overhead fluorescent lighting when that can't be changed, earplugs or headphones in noisy environments, closed doors or high-walled areas to block distracting sights and sounds, avoidance of strongly scented products, a request for permission. Those would all be things to consider in a dialogue with members of a particular congregation to discern what might work for them. And I think at this point, we're led to an aside on the events of recent months, right? You know, this conference, you know, the very nature of this conference in a virtual setting leads us to that reflection. You know, many such changes have been imposed rapidly upon us as local and states regulations have forced worship services into a socially distanced or virtual space. So what to make of that when you know, we have been of necessity in many of our houses of worship forced to adopt some of these changes in a very rapid space of time. Well, I think that first, the disruptions of this year have been difficult for everyone, certainly across the human condition. The change in what has been our habitual mode of relating that goes without saying. But secondly, as we reflect upon our experience of having our worship space upended, of feeling, perhaps not at home in this, Zoom environment. I'm certainly one of those. Let us perhaps not be too quick to rush to return to what was, quote unquote, the normal way, but keep in mind that perhaps for some among us, that feeling of discomfort, unease, is what it is like all the time. And seek to preserve a space for another way, not simply for fear of contagion, but to honor the full spectrum of neurological diversity among believers. So as I said, the value of the first person testimony of those on the spectrum is of unparalleled value. I think that persons on the spectrum are, ideally placed to have that perspective to tell the story there, because they're constitutionally oriented inward. I think of the interior castle of St. Teresa, whose feast we celebrated yesterday, where the soul was envisioned like a jewel through which ultimate reality was accessed by progressing through 7 layers or levels. And these are just 2 examples of that type of spiritual autobiography. Christopher Goodchild is within the Western tradition. He speaks about his difficult journey to receiving an autism diagnosis as an adult, in terms of the crisis of faith and its resolution. Chris Mitchell is someone in the Eastern tradition who speaks about it with that language as well. I think it is important to situate our practice within some tradition. My own is the Western, but in order to give context and boundaries to our practice, especially, when we are starting out, but since we are all always beginning again on the spiritual path. I said earlier that I would give resources to the to organizations that offer suggestions for making liturgical ministry more accessible to the differently abled of all ages. Through the roof.org and keyministry.org, I found our organizations that are helpful in those regards. And here is my contact information. I definitely welcome further communication as far as any bibliographical references that I did not give or that you didn't catch throughout the presentation. The verses that I read were from this book. I hope that you will be moved to write. I find that since I began writing, my writing has perhaps the effect of calling forth responses in writing from others. So whether you agree, disagree, I think that it's important that the conversation continue. So I want to thank you for your attention today, and just invite you to carry on conversation. Thank you so much. I'll be happy to take any questions that there are.
So if anyone has any questions, please feel free to write them in the chat box, and I will pass them along so that everybody has a chance to ask and hear from Andrea as well. So Andrea, Juan asks, what work have you done with adults with autism?
Thank you for your question, Juan. Is it, as Sean mentioned in the introduction, I do have a private practice here in Houston, and that is one of the areas in which my private practice focuses. And as well, my writing does focus on that theme as well. So both a practical and a research focus. I realize that most of my colleagues who do specialize in autism, or many of them do focus on the younger ages, and I do refer those younger age clients to those colleagues, but my focus is on adults in the spectrum.
So we also have another question. Someone asks, how would an individual obtain a diagnosis of autism?
Okay, that's a good question. Yes, so any licensed practitioner could offer a diagnosis of autism um, psychiatrist, psychologist, after meeting with the client and offering assessments and taking a history, there are many persons who begin to for a variety of reasons notice the various traits within themselves, either through reading, the literature. Sometimes parents have a child who is diagnosed with autism, and then they, through gaining more information, they find that that diagnosis helps them make sense of those areas or experiences in their life, and that moves them to seek further diagnosis and therapy. Or sometimes persons are satisfied with that personal research and understanding that they do. It just depends on their various needs in life.
Thank you. And we also have, so Curtis asked if you could go back one slide to share the information about the books.
Yes.
And then Betty also asks, have you attempted to identify children and adults who are non-clients who might benefit from your insights?
Well, what an interesting question. I am, privileged to be in this setting today and reaching out to a broader audience. Also outreaching through my writing, but certainly open to other opportunities and possibilities for conversation.
So we also have the question, how do you support an individual with autism on their spiritual journey and understanding it?
Yeah, I think that this is this goes to the heart of the question that's being raised today. Thank you for that. I think that what got me started thinking about this is that on the one hand, I noticed that much of the what had been written and said, I mean, there's not much on this at all, but what there was, the more traditional writings spoke about the experience of the people who ministered to those with differences, with disabilities. An example of that tradition might be John Vanier, Vanier, and the Arche movement, Arche. That movement is small communities of people that live together with persons who are differently able, not just with neurological differences, but all sorts of different abilities. But what I have been able to understand of that movement, the writing or understanding is more of the experience of the neurotypical ministers to the differently abled people. On the other hand, you have writing or experience that is more, for lack of a better term, from the New Age direction, that is written more from the perspective that persons on the spectrum have already arrived or already attained, union with this higher power, God, or however you want to describe that. And an example of that type of writing would be Stillman, God and the Autism Connection, right? So, neither of that direction, speaks to what I was hoping for, is the voice of persons on the spectrum describing what is their own path, what is their journey, how did they forge their path of faith. So yes, I think that this conversation is very much needed and very much in progress in our local churches, communities, places of worship.
Thank you. And so we have one other question before a comment. Molly states, changing the conversation of autism from pathology to neurodiversity. How could we change educational structure for school-age children?
So I'm going to think about another resource for you as far as neurodiversity. The neurodiversity movement is very strong in the autism community, and when we use that term, specifically, it's with that connotation of it being another way of being human, and another way of expressing the human experience, rather than being something that is wrong or needs to be cured, right? That's what proponents of the neurodiversity movement mean by that term. So I'm wondering if it may be helpful to you and to others to look at the resources offered by ASAN. ASAN is the acronym for the movement. ASAN is the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network. That's what it stands for. And I believe that would be one of the leading proponents of neurodiversity in this context. Yes, I wish I could speak more to the school-age children. Possibly the next presenter will have more on that.
And then we have a comment here from Rose Ann. She says, Andrea, thank you for what I call a fresh eye or view on this topic. Thank you for allowing me to hear and see this differently. Thank you for your poetry.
Well, thank you for being a part of it, Roseanne. And I appreciate your words. I'm so glad that, you know, after all the difficulties of this year, that this conference was finally able to happen, and that you all were able to be a part of it.
So it looks like we don't have any more questions or comments. Andrea, thank you so much for sharing your wisdom and your time with us. And we have a scheduled break from 2:30 until 2:45, but if you all are feeling so inclined, perhaps we could take a longer break. So from now until 2:45, we can take a break, and when we return, Rachel will be joining us.